So our next question is, how can we keep the bias out? Now, this is keeping the bias out when we're presenting information, when we're giving our own data, but also it's when we look at somebody else's information. We want to kind of see through bias and keep our own bias from affecting how we're seeing the information. Now, here's the sad part. It's basically impossible. You can't really keep the bias out. But there are a lot of things we can do to make sure that our viewpoint sees the big picture. And there are ways we can look out for bias and ways that graphs can be misleading. But something we're going to practice in class a lot is see what's missing from the story. We need to try to see the bigger picture. Ask those questions. What else do we need to know to see it? Because there's no graph that captures the whole story, no set of data that captures the whole story. So we need to think bigger. So one thing to be careful of is, where does the information come from? So remember that when you're looking at media sources, you want information that has high fact reporting. Okay, so we're up here in these top tiers. I would say at least in the yellow, preferably up here in the green. And then as far as looking at whether you're more liberal or conservative leaning, don't just go the direction that you yourself get pulled in your own political viewpoints. You got to look at both sides and then consider it when you're looking at their data. If this source is more liberal or more conservative, then they might have data that reflects that in a way that it might be skewed. So I'm not saying never look at a liberal source or a conservative source. Instead, just consider that when you're looking at the data itself. And I personally like to live more in the center here. So I like up here, these are the news sources I want up here, not down here in the corners, okay? So I'm not going to actually show this video, but it is accessible on the slides, and we might see it in class. But this is a cool study. It's about politics and math. Literally, if you have a strong understanding of politics or strong opinions, it affects how you see the data. So that's something we need to be careful of when we're looking at something. We don't want our own bias to affect how we're seeing math. Like cold, hard numbers can be affected in our brain because our worldview affects everything we see and how we see it. So we need to be careful about that and find ways to mitigate that problem. So part of that is what I was talking about, is confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is the tendency that we have as humans to interpret new evidence as confirmation of what we already believe. So even if we're looking, so this is why two people can look at the exact same information and say, oh yeah, that definitely goes with what I believe. And the other person looks at the same thing and says it means that what they believe is true, which is very different from the other person. You see this so much with Democrats and Republicans. They'll look at the same information and come up with opposite viewpoints. And that's confirmation bias. And probably neither of them is correct. It's somewhere in the middle. And so we need to work to kind of overcome our own confirmation bias. So check out this graph. It's about gross domestic product, which is a measurement of how well the economy is doing. But it looks like, oh wow, 2016, it was doing amazing. And oh my gosh, poor 2009, they had almost nothing. But here's the problem with this graph. The y-axis starts at 47,000. Now, I don't know if it was the goal of this graph, the people that made this graph, to make it seem misleading or not. I don't know. If you looked at the graph in its entirety, it'd be just super tall and hard to look at. And so maybe they were just trying to condense things to make us be able to see the whole thing. But we got to be careful. 2016 was not like 7 times bigger than 2009. No, it was just a difference of like, $5,000 or so. So we need to watch out for misleading graphs. We'll work on that. We'll practice. And we also need to look for misleading variables. There's a series of videos we're going to check out. But what we're hoping for always is to have reliable and accurate data. That is what our goal is. We want reliable, accurate, valid data so that the information we're looking at is reality.